So I may alternate standing and sitting depending on how tired I get. But, so first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for having me here. I know it's a Sunday and it's probably tough to get out and do all this. From what I've been told, the traffic is not nearly as bad on Sundays, so that's good. That helps us all out. So really what I want to focus on today is just kind of talking about components, because nowadays in Ember, this is really the building block of everything. So I had to do this for my friend. Which actually should be living in a component mode. You know, just, it's actually a partner at my company, and he said, "Oh, you have to definitely start with Journey." I'm talking about start with Journey. So anyway, they're starting with Journey. Okay. So a little bit about me, like they said, I run the Boston Ember meetup. I have a site called From Rails to Ember, which is sort of a way to for Rails developers with that kind of mindset to focus on Ember. Truth be told, I've had a lot of other things stealing my time away, so that hasn't been updated too much recently, but I hear it's still a nice resource, and I do have plans to continue it. EchoBind is the company that I work for. We do Rails and Ember consulting, based mostly out of Boston. We have one guy that's in Louisville, Kentucky, which is kind of the middle of the US. So yeah, we're basically going to start off talking about component all the things, because that's what we do now. But before that, let's just kind of think about, well, how do we get to that point, right? So we hear components are great, use them all the time, well, why? So components are really good because they're reusable, little modules of functionality, they're isolated, they're easy for us to test. Actually, if you guys give me just 1 second, I'm going to go something so I'm not leaning over so much. Sorry. So now the three bars. Okay, good. Okay, so components are isolated. They're very easy for us to test. Now, when I say isolated, they're isolated by default. They're kind of a module. It's kind of self-contained. You can make them not isolated, but by default, we're saying isolated. They're easy for us to test. So components are tested using integration tests in Ember, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But it's much easier than sort of doing the full level acceptance test, spinning up your entire application. They're much, much faster. And so you can actually test the inputs and outputs using components to easily test the modules of your app. So this is a big reason. Components will eventually be natively supported in all the major browsers. So this chart is sort of up to date. The one that we're sort of thinking about is the little HTML symbol. That's what we consider sort of, if you've heard the term angle bracket components, that's what that thing means. And it's basically you're defining your own tags, your own HTML tags. So you can imagine that once we have some of that stuff, it's going to be, when they're supported by the browser natively, you're going to get better performance in certain areas. So that's why that's important. So components sort of are all of those things, but the reason that we're using them the way that we're using them outside of those things comes from controllers. And so controllers in Ember have kind of two responsibilities. They decorate models for templates, and they store state as a singleton. And I'll go over what both of these things mean. So talking about decorating models for templates. So basically, this is something you've probably seen a controller do if you've used Ember. You have maybe in a model hook, you've got an array of things, and then you just want to sort them. So this is a way to very easily, out of the box, provide sorting capability to your template. Your template is just going to look at sorted things, and it's going to use them. So that's what I mean by decorating a model. The other major piece is storing state as a singleton. And for most people, this is a really bad thing, right? So what happens here is you set some state up in your controller on a route, you go to another route, and then you come back and you're suddenly seeing the old data that was there before, which is not what you usually expect. So most of the time, this functionality is bad in the case of controllers. There are certain times when you want to use this. And so two things happened as Ember evolved. We figured out that components can handle the decoration responsibility entirely. So if you think of that type of decorating model stuff, you can do it always in a component. So one thing to think about is instead of adding controller properties to do those things, you can probably just make a component and put it in there, pass whatever you're going to make the properties around, pass it down. Singleton became this thing called services. And so basically in Ember, you can set a service for something like current user, or say that you were making, say you were making iTunes and you had a queue of songs that you were keeping track of. You can set that as a service, and then you could, throughout anywhere in the application, you can query that service and say, hey, what's my current queue look like? Just say, you're in the context of some artist page and you want to add something to the queue. It's pretty easy to look that up and to keep track of it all in that one place. So that's when the store state is great as a singleton, but doing that in a controller, you have to sort of pass it all back up and sort of set it on the right thing. Typically, people used to set application controller to do this type of stuff, and it got pretty messy. So now these are the two ways to go. So, okay. So then you might think, well, if we can replace both of those responsibilities, and those are really the two reasons for having controllers, when can they go away? So we don't really need them, right? Well, if you've read anything about Ember 2, you know that it was planned to get rid of them as soon as Ember 2.0 came out. There were some snags, and they didn't quite get there. So there are two kind of major blockers, one minor blocker. The major blocker is query params. That's probably the biggest. So currently, if you use query params in your Ember application, you have to define it on the controller. You have no real choice. Fairly soon, I think it's behind a feature flag in Canary at the moment. Fairly soon, you should be able to define these on the route, which is kind of where they belong. But as of right now, don't try to work around that. If you're needing to use query params in your application, just put them on the controller. That's totally fine. A lot of times, people think controllers are bad, don't use them, but there are some specific cases where you have to. This is one. Okay. The second blocker is that we do not have routable components yet. And what that means is the way that things work now, you type in the URL, it hits the router to find out which route it should transition to. When it goes to that route, we set the model hook on the route to give it data, and we pass that. That model becomes a model property on the controller. That's how things work today. Basically, that piece should be replaced by routable components. So again, remember you use components for decorating the models. If the route can talk directly to the component, then basically instead of setting model on the controller, it's going to set attributes top level on the component. And so that's going to sort of get us the piece to where we can really eliminate the need for controllers. But these are not here yet.
Not just one component.
Right, definitely not.
There will be multiple components and it will have its own model.
Yes. So you will dictate one that will be, you will dictate one that will be the routable component. And so that's sort of like what I'll show in a minute, is just sort of creating a top level component, so to speak. So what I do now is in my templates, pretty much the first thing I do is I add a component top level and pass down context to that. And from within that component, you can have multiple subcomponents to handle it. And so it encapsulates things pretty well. And so when routable components are a thing, it's going to be that same philosophy, but you're just going to be able to wrap it right there. So you won't have that extra layer of defining the component in the template first. Just what you have to do that. But yeah, definitely you want lots of components in there. Okay, so these are the two sort of major blockers. There's a fix for a minor blocker that I will get to in just a minute. But let's talk about sort of building blocks with components. Right? What are the functionality that components give you, pieces that you can use to leverage your app? So the first one is yield. So this is the first one that people encounter. As soon as you generate something in Ember like generators, you're going to get a test. Sort of test this for you. So you're immediately going to get a normal component test. It's just going to give you the normal invocation, and you're also going to give it it's going to generate it using a block. And it's basically just going to do something like this, right? So you're going to have a component that you can pass a block to, so I'm passing this text gets inserted. And then the template in the component just has a yield. And so all it's saying is whatever you're giving me, just stick it in that yield. So this is sort of the default case. And you'll notice a lot of times if you're creating a new component, you get those two tests generated. Very quickly they will fail if you don't keep the tests up to date, because you'll have a component that doesn't need a block, and so the block test will fail. Or maybe you have a component that only takes a block, and so the other one will fail. So yield is sort of the first thing we get to. The other thing you can do with yield is you can use the block paren format. So that's where we have as, and we're passing 2 arguments in that block. If you've used Ruby, this looks very similar. We're still using yield in the same way before, but we're using, in this case, I'm using a helper called concat. It's just going to take these 2 values and put them together. But you can see this right here, sum, is being passed out of the component, and we're using it directly here. And so inside of that component, you can just yield this way. So yield can take no arguments. It can take any number of arguments. And it can also take this. And so what that means is you can actually yield out the component in yield. And so if you use the this keyword instead of sum here, then the sum component will actually be yielded out, and you can do things with it. So we'll look at in a little bit why that can be helpful. But it's just something to keep in mind. So if you ever find yourself needing to look at something on the actual component itself, that's kind of where you go.
Is that a good practice to have a reference of parent is in the company trying to migrate the state of the child?
Yeah, so when you're doing parent-child components, that's definitely one. And I will talk about that. You don't always want to pass it, so only if you need to use it. You don't want to always just, hey, in every component, I'm just going to yield this all the time. So here's another thing that yield can do that a lot of people don't really use. And I know it's maybe a little bit cryptic until you learn it, but there's this magic else block that you can do. And the way that you do that is, here's our normal yield, and then down below there's this to inverse. And what's great about that is it automatically gives you a way to yield out. This is a typo, ignore that slash. But basically what this is doing, if you're going through in each block in Ember, you can have an else case. And what that else case will do is gives you an easy way to say, if the array is empty, then use this text. So if you forget this for a second, and we're just looking down here, and again, pretend I didn't type that wrong. And we just had a text here that says no cars. And this here just said the car name. So that would basically, that's what you use else for. And each has that, obviously if has an else block. But you can leverage the to inverse to give you that functionality in your components, which is really powerful, because if you're looking here, we made a car list component, we're passing cars down, we're yielding car out so that we can use the name, and then we want a customizable message when there are no cars available. So that way we don't have to have this statement above it where you say, if you have cars, render the component, otherwise don't. You can just do this, and you have a really nice way to encapsulate all that logic. So this is a really nice thing to do in most components where you have to iterate over a list. You should probably use this. Okay, so what you just brought up, parent-child. So this is when we're going to have nested components, and we're going to be sort of taking, so like I said, you have a top-level component, and you'll have a couple more below that, and sometimes they need to communicate with each other. So this is an example, non-working, but an example table component that can do something like that. So with the table, you're taking a table in a row that gets yielded out. And so this is what we just talked about using this inside of yield. So this is going to actually give me access to the table. So we're in the custom table template. So that's sort of our context. So when I say this, I'm actually getting this custom table component. And I can then call properties on it. So what I'm doing here, so this gives me table back out. And then I'm actually passing table down to my column, assuming that the column is going to need to do something with it. And so this is how the column can say, hey, table, what headers do I have? What are all the columns that are available? Things like that. Or send messages back and forth. Something you don't want to tie them up together too much. You definitely want to be able to communicate in certain ways. So a common way to do that is once you have the table in the did insert element hook. So this is what's going to be called right before your component renders, or right when a component renders to the page. This is equivalent to DOM ready in jQuery world. Then basically you can just say, get the table property that's passed to us, and call register column, and again pass this. This is inside of the child, so this is going to be in the child component. And so it's actually telling the table to register this child as one of the classes. And in the same, anytime you do this type of functionality, you have to also clean it up. And so in will destroy element, when your component is about to be torn down, you basically get the table and you unregister that same element. And so you leverage these two things together. You define it this way, and then you're able to provide this kind of communication between parent and child once they've been set up. So if you never need to tell the parent anything in particular, you just need to get a property off the parent, you may not need to register the child directly. This is only the case where the parent needs to iterate over the children or needs to do something with that child. Okay, so sort of building on that functionality, there's this new thing in Ember 2.3 called contextual components. So this takes all of that one step further. It looks a little bit weird, and I'll admit the first time I saw it, I was like, wow, that's way too much code. Why would I do that? But there's a new helper that we got called cache that will allow you to sort of create an object on the fly. So if you need to ever pass a simple object around, you can just use the hash helper, ignoring the rest of this for a second. What this is doing is it's actually using the component helper, so this is another helper, that's going to give us, look up a component dynamically by name. And so you have, I have a crazy row component that's being looked up. That's taking the table. And now it's going to yield out this entire thing in our yield. And so what will happen in the yield is that you will get, when it comes out, so basically you'll have access to row. You'll be able to say table.row, table.row. So table now is just, before contextual components, you could not do this piece. So basically it's just a way to say the outer context, whether that's another component or just a template, doesn't have to know what row does or what it really is. It just knows that it can do some stuff with it, or maybe give it a block, give it some additional context. And so this is the sort of the big, most common example of this is the form builder. So if you've used Rails and you've used form before, that type of thing where you say form gives a block just like this, and you say form.text field or form.label or something like that. It's the same idea. These don't have a lot of use yet because they're pretty new, but I just wanted to sort of build up on all these levels to sort of show this is one of the things to get. So to really use all of these things, you need to communicate with actions. So actions, if you've used previously, have this crazy bubbling semantics, so where if you call an action, it will bubble up to nested controller, your parent controllers, if you have any. It'll go to your route. From there, it'll bubble up to the application route. It's just all kinds of stuff that can get really not fun to track down and reason about. And it's just to newcomers, it's really, really strange. So closure actions came about as a solution for us to send an action up through multiple levels, basically just wrapped as a function. So it creates a closure function around the action. And we can call it, just like you would a normal function in JavaScript. It's really, really cool. So if you have this sort of many levels of nesting in your components, so say you have a top level component that has a child that has a child that has a child, and way down there somewhere you have a bucket that eventually needs to go fetch new data. So previous closure actions, you had to actually call send action on a component to get to the first level. And from that, you had to call send action to get to the next level, and so on, until you were all the way up the tree. So it got a little bit annoying. So basically what you can do is we can say, I have this action called unupdate thing. this is how you do a closure action. So you're basically just wrapping it in parens. It's going to look up that action on the current context, which is going to be, in this particular example, it's a wrap template, so it is going to be a controller even if you don't have a controller created. But if this was inside a component, it would be a component. But it's basically going to look up this action and wrap a function around it. And you're able to add arguments at any level to it. So any of your child components can pass along something else that can get later used. And so essentially what we do is this is passing down. This child is taking it, and it's going to actually look at the action that was in. I'll have to update this as well. So this action gets called on the component. This here should also have on update thing. It's just getting passed down. And finally, at the very bottom level on this child, you click the button. It's calling an action on update thing. It knows it's a function. It's this special closure action. So we will actually go all the way up back to the top. Because of the way that we define it here, and we pass this thing all the way again. If you don't do it that way, it's not going to magically just pass it all the way back up for you. It's just that you're wrapping it, passing that context all the way down through any level, and then calling it later. Another thing you could do if you didn't want to do this directly from the template is you can call an action inside the component that this is in. And in that component, you can do some stuff and then just call this on update thing as a function. And you can pass the context there. But the idea really to keep in mind with closure actions is at the heart of it, they're just functions. So if you're ever needing to do something with it, you're just going to be calling a function. Handlebars will magically do that for you. It's actually going to call it. So if you've seen adders kind of thrown around, this.adders, new component world, it's adders. You've seen a getAdder function. Ricardo Mendez had a post recently on this that basically lists two adders or not adders. And this will be what we do in the future, but right now it has a little bit of oddities, so it's just easier to not pay attention to it. So in this example, you could say adders dot on update thing because it's an attribute on the component that you're trying to call. But it's actually just safer to not do that and use it as a top-level property, just like you would one. So that's what he's saying about it. So basically, just for now, just ignore that adders is even a thing. It doesn't really matter. When you set properties on a component like this, they'll be available as a top-level component. In the future, these will only be available as adders. And the reason for that is that you can have other properties in your component that are used that are sort of independent of that. So you can sort of see what is passed in and what's not very easily. But again, for now, it's just easier to not deal with that whole situation until it becomes necessary. Okay. So one of the really, really cool things about using closure actions is because they're just functions, you can have return values. So it was kind of fire and forget before. So if you sent an action, there's no return. It's just, in fact, if you return, it would actually do the bubbling stuff that I talked about a minute ago, which is bad, typically. This we can actually set a return somewhere and use it. And so the best use case for doing that is to return a promise and leverage that inside of your component. So what I'm doing here is we have on update thing, we have a closure action called do update. And I'm going to show you that on the next slide. But basically what's going to happen is there's going to be a button that calls this action. And what we're going to do is, you can see that we're getting the on update. And because this is a function, we're calling it as a function and giving it context. But then we also have a promise. We should have a return. Okay. This needs to have a return in it so we can actually leverage it. And I will go through and update all this stuff so that the slides are not out of date. But basically what it's going to do is, okay. Old slide, new slide. Okay, so the return. So basically this is what I was trying to say. So you have thing.save. This is going to use Ember data that will return a promise. You can actually return that promise back down and leverage it inside of your component. And so we know that when this thing is called, you can also hook into the promise here. So you can actually use in multiple levels. And this is something that was not possible at all before. That's a little confusing. But the short of this is to basically just use closure actions all the time. They give us a lot of stuff that standard actions don't. So if in your code you have a lot of send action or just send lying around, you probably want to convert them to this format. And this is going to be the format in the future. Eventually the other stuff is going to go away. And this works well today, so it should be used. You have to, yeah.
Signing some action which is defined right there, and if you because the parent was here defined it but when you're passing down the components,
As a property. Yes. So the top, where you first set it up, in the top component, that's the closure action. Everywhere else, you're just passing the property down.
so the actual action is defined where you
Yes.
everywhere else.
Yes. Everywhere else, whatever that property is. So if it was, you know, I don't know.
The child also you have done like define some proxy action which is eventually called. So do some modification then call it that action. So again you define
Yeah. Yeah, typically you just want to take whatever context at the outer level and pass it down as far as you need it. Usually when you have the nested situation, your child components are going to fire actions that need to do something outside of the component. And typically you want to use routes to fetch your data and pass all the data down. And so that's why this type of stuff is good, because that button that's 20 components down can basically say, hey, go fetch more users. So that'll go all the way back up to the route and fetch more users. So, yeah, but the important thing to remember is that where you set it up is when you use the closure. And otherwise, you're just passing it down until it needs to be used. And when it needs to be used, you're just calling a function, or in handlebars, you just use the action keyword and property. So this is one use case where this looks a little funny. The reason why I wanted to point that out is that this action thing normally takes a string. That's kind of the normal way to use it. But now with closure actions, you have to actually create the closure action using the keyword action. So you're wrapping that in parentheses, and you're giving it an action. So that use case is weird if you happen to be it. It's not super common, but I did just want to point it out just in case. More often than not, you're creating it up top and passing it. Okay, so another building block inside of components, we have dynamic components. So we touched on this a little bit with the contextual components that I mentioned, but it uses this component helper. And so if you remember way back, I basically used parentheses and a head component inside of it. Since it's a helper, you can invoke it that way with the handlebars sub-expression, which instead of going from right over that, we need to explain what that means. Handlebars has this context of sub-expressions, and so that's when you see inside of handlebars, when you see this stuff, all that's saying is use a helper within a helper. And so anytime you see that stuff, that's, you know, this is at its heart just a helper. And so it's doing the same kind of thing. And whenever you see that type of stuff used, that's in handlebars, that's called sub-expression. And you can nest those infinitely, but you really should not. So there's an add-on that people use called ember truth helpers. It gives you some nice helpers like EQ, GT for greater than, or sometimes what will happen is you'll get multiple levels of if and or something, and you have like 20 parentheses. It's just, we'll talk about how to clean that up shortly. But yeah, so this component you can use like you're doing here. So just like you would as a normal component, helpers are invoked the same way in your template. And so you can do things like format date. You can make a format date helper. There's lots of stuff you can use helpers. Helpers are really underused. They can do a lot. They can clean up a lot of your logic. So this is the component helper that basically just will render a component based on the string that it gets. So you can do so one way using a property. So this is a property that would give, so user profile component, let's say that that's going to say admin profile or user profile. It could be two strings that would return something. You can return that and it will look up those components dynamically using that component keyword. If it doesn't exist, you'll get an error and things will blow up. So they need to exist. But this is a really nice way to sort of use duck typing and basically have one thing that can work for multiple components. Now, the one caveat with this is you have to pass all the arguments to all of them. So you are going to sometimes set properties you don't need on components, but it cleans up logic a lot because you're not going to have a bunch of if it's a user profile, then render this component. If it's an admin profile, render this. This is another use case where it just collapses all into one nice line. If you don't do it this way with the property, you can also use the sub-expressions, which we just mentioned. Use the concat helper, which I briefly blazed over short a little bit ago. But concat is basically just a simple helper that takes any number of arguments and sticks them together. Very simple. And so the use case for this is where you want to make a dynamic component based off some property, but you don't want to necessarily make another property just to do that. So sometimes the context is nicer to see right where you need it. And so you know that like user type is just a property that's maybe used elsewhere in this template, so it's pretty easy to reason about it. So this is how I use it most often. Again, be careful nesting some expressions too. Okay, so helpers. So this is what I just mentioned, EQ is a helper. One thing I really want to point out that everyone should try to do is anytime you have complicated logic in your templates, so again, you start nesting if, and, or something, multiple things, add a helper to do that. So all you have to do is if you find yourself writing it out and it looks really messy, just make a helper and pass that stuff down. It's just instantly cleaned up. Plus you can test the helper much easier than you can test the template. So it's a really nice way to clean things up. And so let's say that you have a chart component. And the reason I put helpers with components is they're independent. They're in both the same kind of way. They look the same because you use curlies to do components. You can also use curlies to say helpers. But you often use helpers to pass things to components. And so this is a use case. Let's say your API doesn't quite return things formatted how you need it for a charting library. And your adapter that you've used to try, or your serializer that you've used in Ember to sort of translate all that stuff still doesn't get you everywhere you need to go. Not to mention, you probably need to use that data elsewhere in your application, so you maybe don't want to use it in a serializer. So this would be a way to make a helper called options from data, take the data, manipulate it how the charting library needs it to be, which is usually a very, very weird format, and then pass it in. So this is a use case of where you could sort of put this stuff in sort of the component, but you're probably going to have multiple charts across your app, and they're all going to have this type of stuff. This is when it's really nice to use a helper in that logic. Yeah.
I keep pattern to what handle the switch to be working.
Yes. Yes. This was very hard for me to come to terms with. Yes. Well, so this sub-expressions have been supported in handlebars for a long time. We've used them before all of this stuff. We've used them for query parameters, and that's about it. So we have to use weird syntax and use query parameters. Yeah. So this, I initially was like, no, I'm not doing it this way. I'm setting properties, passing it down. But as I'm using more and more components and things are more dynamic, there are definitely cases where you just need to quickly create a property to call a component. And things like that, it's super helpful. You can definitely take it way too far. So even if you're not nesting, you can have tons of these things all over, and then suddenly your template's unreadable, and you don't know what you're doing. So yeah, still don't go crazy with it, but there's a lot of cases where it's definitely was a bit of an anti-pattern. So now it's a pattern. We made it a pattern. Okay. So these are sort of all the component building blocks, all the things you can use in components to help you interact. So I want to talk about kind of how we should do it. So there's this term thrown around a lot, data down, actions up. I'm sure a lot of you have heard this. But really, it's just a way for us to easily reason about flow. If you've looked at React, this is where this sort of mindset came from. Before, we had a bunch of two-way binding, and it was really bad. And things would just change out in your app, and you didn't know why. And it was all kinds of bad. So basically, this is just all we want to do is fetch our data, pass it down to components, pass it down to any number of levels. Inside of those components, have some type of user action that will go back up. That's really what you want to keep in mind most of the time. There are cases where you click something in the component and it just changes state. So maybe it'll toggle visibility of the section. Keep that in the component. But you want to, if you need to fetch new data, you have to get all that out of the component. So you want your actions to go back down. So that's really the main thing to keep in mind with this, is that you always want the data to flow in the components and actions to flow out. Very important. So there's basically angle bracket components, which I touched on a little bit, not calling them angle bracket components, but it's basically the custom HTML tags that are eventually going to be supported in browsers. That's what that means. And so it's basically, instead of using the syntax my chart this way, you're just going to be able to say angle bracket my chart. And so the reason these are not in Ember yet is because they were getting rid of two-way binding. So that was our way to opt in and say, so basically you didn't upgrade to say, crap, my app is all broken now, we have to fix the entire thing. Component by component, you can opt in. And you can use the angle bracket component and say, okay, this is going to use one-way binding. No two-way bindings, totally data down, actions up, we're fine. And then you move along throughout your application. These are now going to be called glimmer components, and so you may hear both of these terms thrown around. I'm hoping this lands fairly soon. EmberConf is coming up at the end of March, and there's a lot of big announcements there. So my hope is that this is a thing and routable components are a thing. Fast boot is getting closer, but it's not quite. But it's usually lots of exciting stuff happens. So. Ember will handle that. Yeah. It's basically Chrome. It's basically Chrome. I think, yeah, there's one other browser that kind of supports it. Yeah. There's a polyfill for it, essentially. They're going to handle everything, and then eventually, once browsers support it, they'll take that away. And yeah. You don't have to worry about, does this work with browsers? It'll do that. Yeah, for sure. So, okay, so I just said this, but basically by doing that, you're opting into this one-way data flow. So before this happens, if you keep that data down actions up in mind and sort of develop your app that way, converting to this becomes really easy. Because you basically know that things are in good shape. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind as you're going. There are certain cases it doesn't always work out. Just sometimes on a form you just need it to be two-way binding. You can definitely work around it. You can do it all the perfect right way. But there's some funny stuff you have to do. React directly influences. Yeah. So they saw what React was doing. They said, this is an awesome idea. We do this because there's been a lot of pain historically around two-way binding. Observers, if you use those in your app, and suddenly things magically change around, you have no idea where it came from. If you've ever tried to trace back a property change when you don't know where it came from, it's really, really hard. And so the whole thing was just keep it, it's very easy to follow it. And then you might be following it through a chain, through multiple levels, but that's okay because you can see how things are getting. Yeah. Yeah. Use observers in your app. Stefan Benner has an awesome talk on that basically talks about how you can avoid them. So if you find yourself starting to write one, then watch that talk. But the short of it is a lot of times you can use the getter inside of property. Yeah, and this whole model helps you not need that. Because usually people would say, oh, when a value changes, that observer to tell me to change, and do so. But really, you want to be explicit about how things happen. Okay. So the next thing, how to component, we touched on before. Don't use the adders keyword right now. Just pretend it doesn't exist. Just call them as top level properties. Things will work just fine. Use closure actions, which we talked about. Anywhere in your app, again, that you use send or send action should be replaced by this. Pretty easy to do. But if your app is fairly new, you may not have any of those anyway. You might be using all this already. Okay, so this is a newcomer, new recommendation. So basically closure actions, there's one caveat, and that is that they only work on the current that current context can be a component or it's a controller, right? We want to try to, where we can, move away from controllers. You can't call a closure action and have it go to a route directly. So that kind of sucks. So there's this thing in Dockyard release called Ember Route Action Helper that Robert Jackson helped put together. And this is really awesome. So basically, it just takes that away for you, so that you can actually use closure actions that have a target of the route. So if you add this to your app, the only thing you really need to do with controllers is query frameworks. So that's really nice. And so you can actually sort of, this is like when I said the minor caveat earlier in the talk, this is what I meant. And so we have basically two things. We have the routable components aren't here yet that we talked about. And then the other one that I'm forgetting is the jet lag that I talked about. Yeah, so this is really good. So I would highly recommend using this. Just install it and try it out on one thing. You see basically all that you do is instead of action, you say route. So yes, this is not native Ember, but this is very similar to how things will work once you're able to do this. So once routable components land, then you can use the normal action. That's basically the blocking. So this is a really nice thing. Okay, dynamic components we talked about. This is where, again, we don't want to do a bunch of if statements. We just want to be able to dynamically render things. And then we say we have a lot of stuff using this. We got something that configures settings like a dashboard. People can say which things to show and hide. This is awesome for that. Okay, pod. So people using pod structure in their apps at all? Does everyone know what that is? Okay. I really recommend doing this. So you don't have to, it's not required. But basically pods give you a way to talk about your app in terms of features. So you might have user is going to be a folder, and that's going to have a route, it's going to have a template, it's going to have a model. So things that are related to user are very easy to see right next to each other. So when you're having all these different types of components, it's far easier to sort of trace down the related things when they all live in the same thing, in my experience. So I highly recommend it. This is eventually maybe going to be the default. It's not fully free yet, or it's not free, but it's not fully decided. So yeah, I'd recommend it. We use this in all of our apps, and I love it. I can't use the normal member structure now, folder structure anymore. I get confused, but yeah, so pods are great. I'd recommend that. Components. Top level components. So we touched on this at the beginning. When you go to create a new route and you set up a template, just make a component top level. So a good case for this is, let's say you have users index. You're fetching a list of users, and you're rendering them out on the page. Well, instead of immediately iterating over the users and saying each user's doing stuff, just say make a users list component. Pass the users down. And then from there, you'll automatically fall into this good structure. So you don't have to do this for every single template. I'm not saying every template must have a top level component, because there are some templates that are just basic templates, and you don't really need to do much with it. But most of the time, this is good. Most templates and apps that I do have. Okay. Helpers. So we talked about most of the helpers. Most use cases for helpers. There's another sort of use case that you can actually use helpers a little bit more like a class. You can inject services onto a helper. So if, for example, your helper needs to look up that, like that playlist example I gave before, maybe you need to get a hold of that and do something with the helper. You have to be careful because you can sort of tangle yourself up, but basically use helpers anytime your app gets complicated in templates. So in your case, if you don't want to use the nested helpers, the sub-expressions, as soon as you get to nest a second one, you go to a helper. And usually I never nest them. Highly recommend that. I don't know if I have all that stuff, but yeah. So I want to take time and talk to everybody about this type of way of thinking and see how you guys are doing it. I know I had a comment in my description about the TV being this, but I ran out of time to run that. So apologize. But I definitely want to give everybody this sort of this overall look of the way we should use these things. So, you guys have questions? Anything we can kind of talk through as a group?